Hey, welcome back. So we are talking about the book, The Story. It's a small group that's going through the story one chapter at a time. Right now we're in chapter 6. So chapter 6 of 31, right, so still a while ago, is a summary of things that happen in the book of Numbers from the Bible. So the story, I'm sure you've heard the speech, it's an abridged Bible. It's for people's first trip through the Bible. So the Bible is kind of confusing sometimes. And the story is good for your first time through. Shouldn't be your only time through, but should be your first time through to get a big picture of what's in the Bible, and also to do it at a pace where you can keep the big picture in your head. So a really great book that Zondervan puts out. Really great for small groups to go through one chapter at a time, which is what we're doing. So we just finished our small group meeting over chapter 6. I want to tell you some of the things we talked about. In each of these, for people that watch these before, I pick a verse of the day. And so part of the material that's covered here, it's basically Numbers and Deuteronomy, right? So lots of information, is the Sermon of Moses. So Moses, in the book of Deuteronomy is really just a sermon, some more laws, and then another sermon. But it's kind of like a real-time, like one day for 3 hours, Moses gave this sermon, and we get it captured here at the tail end of the Torah. And it's one of the most famous things that Moses is recorded of saying. So he says, "Hear, O Israel," and the word "hear" is the word Shama. So this is called the Shama prayer. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sure I'm not. I guess I should say, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one." So there's only one God, and that's the one God we worship. So it kind of starts off with that. So "Hear, O Israel." So listen to this. It's important. And then he says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength." It's interesting later when Jesus quotes this and uses this as a reference, he adds with all your mind as well. So this is kind of like number 4, with all your mind. And then he goes on to add a reference from Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself, right? So there have been thousands and thousands of, especially people of the Jewish faith, that pray this twice a day. So the Shema prayer, they do it in the morning, they do it in the evening. It's my favorite verse in the Bible comes from this. I like the New Testament versions of it better, like Luke 10:27. But this is where it came from, right? So Moses said it when they're outside the Promised Land. By the way, he's talking to the next generation. So we'll talk about the next generation of Israelites here in a bit. But this is from Deuteronomy. And he goes on to say, tie them as symbols on your hand. So everything you do should be directed by these commands here and the commandments. Bind them on your forehead, so like wear it like as a label for who you are. So there's the verse of the day. If there was a runner-up today, it would probably be this one. So again, this is from Moses' sermon to the next generation of Israelites. And one of the points that he made like really clearly in this is that the Lord our God made this covenant with us at Mount Sinai, Horeb. And it wasn't with our fathers. I mean, it was with our fathers, right? So literally, that's exactly wrong. But he's making the point that it wasn't just with those guys, right? It's with us. And so he's really saying that Christians are one body, right? I mean, he wouldn't have called them Christians at this time, but people who believe in God are one body. And this covenant made with all of us that are here alive today. And so you could extend this. So the New Testament does extend this. And say, it's like, you are now the body of Christ, and you're members of it. And we're many, but we form one body. And so, in a way, what this is saying by extension is you were at Mount Sinai. You were there, right? Like you meaning you and I today, you are the body. So it's just it's a really good way of viewing the unity of the church in a way that I think we've lost a little bit today, to be honest. We're very fractured, and people are separated by the differences in their interpretations, and that's not what the goal was with Moses and his first sermon. That's the first sermon that's right here, right? So lots of stories in chapter 6. So starts with the quail plague and also the fires around the outside. Moves from there to Kadesh, where they send out the 12 spies. Kadesh is probably how you say it. They explore the land, and the people decide, we can't win that fight. And so God declares every one of the current generation is going to die in the desert, which leads to 40 more years in the desert. So they get pretty close. They leave Sinai, and then they choose not to go in. And we'll talk about that in more detail. Also in the story is some of the failed tests at every level, including up to the leadership and Moses himself. Some battles that were not in the Promised Land. So east of the Jordan is not the Promised Land, but obviously some tribes settled there. So 2.5 tribes settled there. So we'll talk about that some. Instructions for the pending conquest. I think this is important to talk about because it's going to really lead into what chapter 7 is all about. And then some really interesting things happening in Moab with God blessing them with Balaam from on high, but then what the people are really doing is becoming yoked to the land, especially seen in Moabite women. So we're going to talk about that some, and then of course finish with the Shema sermon. So listen and love is kind of what Moses was preaching as his final message. Really good book to read, Deuteronomy, and to listen to Moses' words. As always, before we kind of dive into the details of the stories, it's important to get the big picture. So the idea of the story is that you can see the 10,000-foot view of God's plan while you get into the low-level details. Where we're at right now is obviously we're well past Adam and Eve, where God dwelled with his people, well past the fall, well past the flood. Abraham started the new covenant. God started a covenant with Abraham. 4 generations later, they go into Egypt, spend 430 years there. Moses brings them out of Egypt, and now we're kind of in Moses's final 40 years of his life. And really what I would see this as is this is kind of like the growing up phase of the Israelites. Like it's not like they're a body, not an individual, but it's kind of like a childhood or an adolescence of growth in the desert before they're ready to enter the Promised Land. So some really interesting analogies here to like adolescence and growth, and then like I kind of see the Moabite women as like going off to college, right? And so the challenges that can come with really being out there in the world, and so that's kind of where I see the people of Israel, if they were an individual, where we're at in the story. Lots of fun videos to watch for this. There's the story guide from Randy is linked on here. The one that we watched in our small group is we watched this Bible Project overview of Numbers. It's kind of the best historical review just because there's so many stories, and they do a really nice job of doing it with animated images, and it helps you keep it straight, right? So we watched that together. There's an update that's for the Number series. The Deuteronomy is great to listen to, but to learn more about the sermon. And then, of course, Maryland, this is the church I go to, talked about like this choice of the 12 spies and saying yes to the Lord and how important that is. So lots of good videos. We're not going to watch any here, but I just kind of wanted to point out some references that you should go watch. Also want to do a shout out to a different Bible Project resource. This is where I got most of my information for today. They have a podcast. Podcasts are still around. Podcasts are great for when you're like listening to something when you can't be watching something. So if you're driving, you can listen to a podcast, or if you're going for a walk or a run, you can listen to a podcast. So I've been listening to their podcast. Right now they're in the middle of Deuteronomy. They've only got 3 of them done, but they did all in Numbers. So I listened to these 12 episodes. They're about an hour each. And it's really fun to listen to Tim and John. So Tim Mackey has just a perspective of the Bible that we would all really benefit from having in our heads better. So I listened to all those and just absolutely recommend those. Timeline. So I always do this thing where I talk about timeline, authors, characters, locations, things like that. The timeline, the best guess is Exodus was 1446. We're talking about the 40 years after that. In fact, we're more specifically talking about the 40 years since Sinai even, right? Aaron dies in this time. They have some military victories. They're currently on the plains of Moab at the end of the Torah. And then Moses dies at the end of the spoiler alert, right? So the first 5 books, the Torah, all written by Moses. This is the final one. I'm really kind of like sad to be leaving the Torah. So chapter 7 in the story won't be the Torah. So this is the end, right? But we're not in the Promised Land yet. Characters, a lot of people you know from previous chapters. Moses, obviously, the main character. his brother Aaron, the high priest, and then Miriam is in this chapter as well. She was the one who encouraged Pharaoh's daughter to get Moses out of the river to begin with. She sang the Song of the Sea, which is how I choose to remember her. And then in this story, it's about questioning Moses' leadership, but I choose to remember her with a tambourine in her hand, right? We, of course, have lots and lots of Israelites. And then we meet two new characters, I guess I should call them. So Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, don't know how to say that word. He's from the tribe of Judah. And then Joshua. And Joshua is the main character. We've met him before, but he's the main character who's going to lead the Israelites in the coming chapters with the Conquest. So the son of Nun, whichever way you want to say it, he's actually from the tribe of Ephraim. I just kind of assumed he was a Levite, but he's from the tribe of Ephraim, and he's going to be the future leader. He's kind of been the apprentice to Moses throughout these chapters, so definitely a person to know. Authorship, so this is the end of the Torah, the end of the Pentateuch. So this is Moses is the author, also the eyewitness. You also see we've always listed this, additions by scrolls and prophets over the years. You see them more visibly, especially in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy has a narrator that kind of like introduces with his like voice from the cloud, narrator voice, introduces what Deuteronomy is, right? And they say things, by the way, it takes 11 days to go from Mount Sinai to Kadesh along this road, right? And like those are obviously from the narrator later. So it took a lot more than 11 days, but that's all it should have taken, right? And they describe when these things happen, very detailed. And then they say Moses began by saying, and then after that Moses talks. And they say very little in the middle, but they also close at the end to tell you about Moses' death. So they kind of provide bookends on Deuteronomy. But you see the voice of the scribes more in Deuteronomy than some of the other parts of the Torah. So I thought I'd mention that there's clearly more than one author. Locations is my favorite slide. So chapter 4 was, of course, coming out of Egypt. Chapter 5 was all Mount Sinai, the New Covenant, the laws, Leviticus, right? And then chapter 6 is the wandering. And this structure follows perfectly with how the Bible is literarily structured, with the mountain being the peak at the end, and lots of symmetric stories happening on each side. So the stories from Exodus and the stories from Numbers have so many parallels, it's crazy. And if you know the words, like Tim Mackey just goes nuts about the parallels between these two sides, saying that the thing that's in the middle was super important, with the Day of Atonement being the middle chapter of Leviticus. So we structured this week a little bit different, and I kind of liked it, so we'll probably do it again. But what I did was I call them story prompts. I made sheets of paper to hand out to the group, and so this way, individuals were in charge of that story. So I took all the stories that are listed here. Those are the right slides. I took all the stories listed here. So these 7 stories, plus I added one more. And I made one-page handouts of it. And I let people in the group lead them, which was, I thought, really, really successful. It just comes better coming from other members of the group. So like the story prompt thing, expect to see this from me in the future. But they're little one-page handouts, which as slides have little bitty text. I don't know if you can read this text or not. But we'll just kind of go through some of these. So these stories are kind of set up chronologically for the most part, when I can do chronological. And so the first one that happens was kind of the first thing from chapter 6 in the story here. So when you read the story, you break open chapter 6. It talks about fires on the outskirts, and then it talks about quail. And so quail were sent to the Israelites before Mount Sinai in kind of a good way. And so it was like they received quail in the evening is what it says. But then apparently we haven't had quail for a while. It's unclear whether it happened one time or many times. To be honest, I read it as happening many times, but it obviously hasn't happened in a while. And the people are grumbling. And so there is a lot of complaining. And for the presenters, I give extra information. I'll give it to you as well. Moses, at this point in the story, just to let you know the level of complaining, he says, if this is how you're going to treat me, go ahead and kill me. If I found favor in your eyes. So if you care about me, kill me, right? And don't let me face my own ruin. So it's going bad, right? Like the story gives you like 3 sentences before we get to this, but it's really like coming to a head, and I'm sure that that Moses and the Lord are in similar mindsets here, and his anger is aroused, and so the people are asking for something different than manna. They're sick of the manna, and so God performs a miracle and sends them quail. They're listed as being up to 3 cubits deep, which is 3 feet in quail. Some readings say like everywhere was 3 feet deep, which would be a lot of birds. Other interpretations say there were piles that were 3 feet deep, so up to your hips in dead birds, right? And so the people eat them and then are struck with a severe plague as a result. And so there's a lot of questions that kind of come up here. And so I'll just kind of read a couple of them. We won't read them all, but you can read them and think about them yourself. So why do a miracle of bring in the quail to kill the Israelites, right? Like it almost feels like a trick. Like it feels like a con, right? So it's like, hey, here's your quail that you asked for, giving you what you want. And then, oh, by the way, you shouldn't eat them, right? And so not everyone died, but obviously some did as a result of this. And so why do it? So I realize these are real people, right? And if I was there, I wouldn't be able to say this because, when you see a real person die, you can't say it. But it really does feel like God is enforcing the covenant. Like they've agreed to this covenant. They've agreed to love the Lord your God. And this level is not love anymore, right? And so God has given them chances. We've let it get to a boil here. And he is enforcing his side of the covenant. In fact, the phrase that God uses is, these people have put me to the test. Like we don't really think that way. We think of like God testing us, but like the people have put God to the test. And so this is one of the tests where they're testing him, and he keeps up the covenant, right? So like he's faithful. He will keep his promises, and his promise is to enforce the covenant. And that's what we're seeing here. And I don't think that the bottom question there, I don't think he delights in this punishment. I mean, it's enforced because, people need to have real reasons to learn, right? And so like whenever we're parents and we're deciding how to train our children and guide them and direct them, positive is definitely a big part of it. You give people manna, you keep their sandals from wearing out, you give them water. There's definitely positive motivations to keep people going. But also at some point people need negative as well, and so we see this as a negative discipline where God is enforcing the covenant. And so I think that's kind of the main thing that's going on here. It's a little bit easy, I think, to see this one with like God's judgment. I think some of the next chapter will be harder when God's judgment is on other people. Other questions in here that I just kind of wanted to point out. God is described, number 6 here. God is described as being angry. The Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. And so the question is, does God get angry? Is that like a thing? I thought he was like in charge and like cool, calm, collected. And I would say that, yeah, he gets angry. So we are made in God's image, and God is at a point of outrage, right? So like I'm sure he can control his actions, but like God definitely gets angry, like genuinely angry. And this is a time. And so if we're images of God, that means that there are times where we should get angry. We typically have trouble using anger. Usually anger leads to sin for us. But anger, Jesus used anger as well. He made a whip of cords and drove people out of the temple. But anger is supposed to motivate you to do something that you should be doing anyway, right? And so anger helps the Lord fulfill the covenant, right? Is really what's going on here. So there are times to get angry. I joke with my kids all the time, and I say it's like, anger is something that's good. We're supposed to use anger, but it's a pretty advanced skill, and maybe we'll save using anger until you're a little bit older. And for now, let's work on not being angry, right? So that's kind of where we're at there. So a little tangent there about anger. So I found this to be a really interesting story, and I definitely use it as an example of many things that are going on where God is helping to mature these people, and it applies to my own life as well, right? So in my own life, I realize that I exist because of God, but whenever something bad happens, I say, hey, I want something different out here. That's really what's happening. So don't reject God because you're upset about something specific. So that leads up to kind of the one of the focal points of Numbers. So this is they've journeyed to Sinai. They've started their covenant at Sinai. They're following the cloud. So when the cloud lifts and moves, they follow it. They travel for a little over a year. I forget the exact numbers to Kadesh or Kadesh, whichever way you want to say it. And then from here, they all believe we're marching into the land, right? Like it's happening. This is really happening. They probably don't have a GPS. They probably don't know exactly where they're at, but they're just south of the land. The Philistines, the Canaanites, the Hittites, they're just south of it. And they decide to send out 12 spies, kind of stake things out before we go in. We got to know what we're going to. Very practical move. They pick one person from each tribe, and they send one person from each tribe. Obviously, Joshua was the one chosen from Ephraim to go. Caleb was the one chosen from Judah to go. And then 10 others, right? We don't know the 10 others. Maybe we could guess at them from other places in the Bible. But they go scout for 40 days. They see many things when they're there. They see that it flows with milk and honey. They collect some grapes because it was the season for grapes. The narrator kind of put that in. Oh, by the way, it was the season for grapes, which is fun to read that, right? And they see that the people have big walls, right? They're well fortified. And they see giants, which is the Nephilim is a whole other story. I'll let Tim Mackey tell that story. But this union of evil spiritual beings and people as giants, and so like these people, so like David and Goliath. Goliath was a giant, right? And so be really interesting to see, like, to go take pictures of how big the giants were, or what's going on there. I'm not going to go into that this time, but really interesting. Anyway, Joshua and Caleb, they say, we can do this. We got this. God's with us. Let's go. The other 10 say, no way, right? Like, ain't going to happen. And the other 10, they spread a bad report amongst the camp. They say, it's like, no, we can't go there. And so God let them choose whether they wanted to go in or not. To be perfectly honest, God knew they weren't ready, right? Is really what happened. But God puts them in a position and lets them choose, which is what God does, and they choose not to go in. Now, as soon as they choose not to go in, they've decided, hey, we're not doing it. We're not going to follow your command. We've made our own choice. We're not going in. Then God declares that no one from the current generation, so people 20 and older, men specifically, they were not going to go into the promised land. They're going to die in the wilderness, die in the desert. Interestingly, once they hear God's decree, once God tells Moses and Moses tells them, then they decide, it's like, well, I don't want to die in the desert, so I am going in, right? And so they try to go in also against God's will. Guess how that works out, right? That works out the way you expect. So they're at Hormah. They get defeated by a Canaanite king. Goes badly, just like you would expect it to go badly. They flee and they retreat to the Red Sea, and then they wander. I don't even think this map does justice to how much they wandered. They wander for nearly 40 years in the desert. That's kind of what's going on here. So this moment, this is the focus of the Maryland sermon this week. This moment is a yes moment, right? So this moment is God says go in. You see your enemies, right? You see your enemies are big and scary. You look behind you and you say, we've got, like, our clubs are wearing out. They're a few years old from Egypt, right? And they say there's no way we're going in. So this is their opportunity for yes, and their opportunity for is the Lord more powerful for your enemies, and they are nowhere near ready to say yes. And so this applies to our lives. So I thought the group did a really nice job with saying this better than I could. This applies to our lives, right? So this idea of is God bigger than your enemies applies to us every day, right? So it applies to challenges that we face that we don't think we can overcome. Just you've got to be able to remember that God's bigger, and we can sympathize with the people because they can see their enemies and they know themselves. But it comes down to faith, right? So this faith that God is bigger than your enemies and that God has told you to do this and you can succeed. And it's a lesson which is a challenge to learn, but we're called to learn from the story and others. So really interesting. It's also interesting that God says that he forgives them for this choice that they ask, but nevertheless, they're going to die in the wilderness, right? So you have been forgiven, but nevertheless, there is going to be ramifications of this choice not to trust God. And this is also where the Lord says that they've tested me 10 times, and you can see what some people consider to be the 10, but it's really interesting, that phrase of they've tested me 10 times, and now I'm going to do my part of the covenant. Interestingly, it does not result in them just going straight back to Sinai and restarting. So they have matured some. They wander around the desert in various places. And it's also representative of, they're about 2/12 of the way in, right? So 2 spies out of 12. They're about 17% committed to God. And that is not what we're called to do. Love the Lord your God with all your heart. So just an interesting story here that applies to us today, where we can totally see them as representing things from our own life. So a really interesting thing. The next story that I wanted to list, like there's no order to these next couple, is the process for updating laws. So it's a disclaimer. This is not in the story, right? It's abridged. It's not in here. But I found it really interesting. Tim Mackey talked about it a lot, so I thought I'd mention it. But the law, so Leviticus has a bunch of laws, Exodus and Numbers have a bunch of laws, Deuteronomy has really restatements of the laws, so 4 books of laws, 613 of them total. How do we update? How do we fix things? So this law was given to them in around, 1446 BC, so 3,500 years ago. It's not the ideal law of God, right? And that's where we differ from Jewish people quite a bit, right? It never was, right? It was a law given to them that they would understand, that would help them take steps forward, right? And that's all it ever was. And they update it themselves, and this is not new. They update it as early as 1 year into the covenant. Like they keep getting new laws too, but 1 year in, they run into problems. And the first problem that's mentioned is you must celebrate Passover on this date, and you must be clean at the time to be part of the celebration. But if you touch a dead body, you have to spend 7 days unclean outside the camp. And so the people come to him and said, hey, we're required to celebrate Passover, but we're also not allowed in the camp because, we had to bury somebody, probably a family member, and it couldn't be avoided. So what the law is just going to leave us out. And so Moses goes to God. Moses talks to God about it, and they revise the law. And so as early as 1 year in, we see the process for revisions, right? And this process for revisions is important because most Christians, like modern Christians, we see that God gave the law to the Israelites, and he did. He made a covenant with them. We're not part of that covenant necessarily, but in a way we are, right? Because he made this covenant with God's people. But people tend to dismiss the whole law, right? Just like it's like that's interesting, but I'm not interested at all. But Jesus doesn't say that he came to abolish the law. So he didn't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I'll stop reading it there, but the rest of this paragraph is interesting. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, 6, 7. Totally worth memorizing those chapters, right? Like they're really, really good. But at any rate, Jesus also says, I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven either. So lots going on in the New Testament with the Pharisees strictly enforcing the law and saying nobody's going to get into heaven except for us. But Jesus says you got to surpass it, which basically means you're not going to get to heaven with just the law. It's just impossible. Nobody's good, right? So you have to get to heaven through Jesus. But the thing I'm trying to focus on here is that we don't dismiss the law. We don't abolish the law, but we definitely need to revise it. And we're called to do that based on things I've read in the Bible and my interpretation of things. And we see an example of that here. They're revising it. The next revision that they have comes with 5 women. I'll just go and tell that story real quick. So 5 women, the sons or the daughters of one man. I can't pronounce his name, so I won't. But they come to Moses and said, hey, our father didn't have any sons, and this is unfair because we can't inherit land in the promised land. We won't get any because we're women, and our father's clan is going to die out, and the law is going to result in an injustice. And so Moses goes to God, and Moses and God agree this is not right. So we change the law. I mean, this is like in Numbers, right? They're doing revisions already, and they're called to do it to fix things when situations come up that the law doesn't address or the law didn't think about. And they changed the law, and they let these women inherit property. Now, it's not going to go so far as like gender equality, right? But it will go so far as fixing a problem that the law didn't address, and probably these women's sons will then carry on the name, is kind of the idea. So they do this in Numbers, and then they do this in the New Testament as well, where they continue to revise the law. Jesus himself, the next paragraph after this is like, you've heard it said, don't murder, but I tell you not to be angry with your brother. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I tell you not to look at a woman lustfully. And so how do we change the law, right? How do we get closer to understanding God's laws? And really it comes down to understanding the principles that the law is based on. And Jesus said this very well. This is at the bottom of the page here. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. So that one kind of got added. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands. So this is like the underlying guiding principles of the law. And so the context of human existence changes, right? So they lived in a world that considered blood to be the life of something. Like when it was spilled, it was still the life of something. They lived in a very patriarchal context. And the laws were applicable for their context, their time in history, to help move them closer to the underlying principles of the law. And so we need to continue this process, especially as our context is so wildly different from theirs that we don't throw away the law, but we have changed a lot of it. Like out of the 613, like I'm pretty comfortable with 500 plus of them having changed. A lot of the 10 Commandments is still perfectly accurate. There's no revisions needed to the 10 Commandments, but most of the others need to be updated to our context. And so the question is, how do we do that when we don't have a Moses? So they had a Moses. They just said, hey, Moses, tell us the answer. And then they went and they sat on the couch until Moses told them the answer. And Moses talked to God, and God spoke to him face to face, which is an opportunity we don't quite have face to face, but we can approach God as well. We can talk to God. We can think things over. We can think about the underlying principles, and we can figure out how to revise things that haven't been directly addressed for our time. And that's something we're called to do. And number 5 here, are we expected to figure this stuff out? And I think the best answer to that is Romans 12:2. Through testing, discern the will of God so that you'll know what's good, acceptable, and perfect. And so, yes, you are expected to figure this stuff out. And you're supposed to do it through thoughtful prayer and spending time with God, right? And talking with other people about things and discussing God's laws. And so that's something we really struggle with today because we're so fractured. It's hard to sit down and just have a discussion about how we read some of these things. So you can read the other questions in here. I think that we've kind of addressed most of them, so we'll move on. But updating the law, definitely something we're called to do. And how are we called to do that? And we're not called to just dismiss it all, but to update. Next story, so many stories in here, is about struggles. So a lot of what we see in Numbers is faith test, and especially the failed faith test. We definitely see successes, like there's successful military battles. There are successes in people learning how to get man over 6 days and then save it for the 7 days. There's definitely a lot of successes, but we somehow focus on the failures. And the failures, this is kind of an interesting picture. It kind of starts in chapter 7 on the outside of the camp. It starts with like fires on the outside of the camp. And then the next story is Quail, which is kind of like the heart of the people. And then the next story is the 12 spies. So this is kind of like the leaders of the tribe. So kind of like getting closer and closer. And these boxes, by the way, are different people. So here's like the Judah people, but presumably the leaders were closer in. And so the 12 spies were, in fact, leaders and their failure. And then the next story we see in the Bible, not the story, they took it out of the story just to abridge it, is actually a rebellion of the Levites against other Levites, right? And so one clan of the Levites, so Aaron's clan, were the priest. And then they're just one clan out of the Levites. And then all the other Levites are not priests. They don't kill the animals. They don't make the sacrifices. They're like grounds and maintenance is what Tim called it one time. And so, they move the tabernacle. They clean the tabernacle after the sacrifices. There's a lot of work to be done in moving the Ark of the Covenant, right? And they rebel, and they make an argument that's based on facts. So it's like we're all God's treasured possessions. We're all holy priests. You, Moses and Aaron, have gone too far, saying you're special. And Moses listens to him, right? He doesn't just say, go away, right? He listens to him. He goes to God. They come up with a test for censors, which is really kind of interesting. And he says, God will show which one of us he's chosen. And God shows it in a big way. He swallows them in the earth about as clear as you can get. And so it's the people of Korah and Korah's clan. He doesn't die out, but a lot of them do. There's one clan of Reuben in there as well. So it's not just the Levites, but also one of Reuben's clan. And it just shows these faith tests and failures coming all the way down, even to the very center. And the very center, what it talks about is Moses choosing to strike the rock instead of speak to the rock. I've backed it up just a little bit for this question and kind of generalized it to be like different leadership struggles. So Aaron, back at Mount Sinai, this is 40 years ago, had some struggles. So he shaped the calf with a tool, but then he said, I threw it in the fire and out came this calf, right? Story 2, Miriam and Aaron, they also, this is kind of like getting closer and closer to Moses, right? They say, hasn't the Lord spoken through all of us? Aren't we all prophets? And so they question Moses' leadership. And one of the reasons they question him is because of his wife, who was a Cushite. Cushite is Upper Egypt, which is Africa, so probably a very dark-skinned wife that Moses took here. And so they question Moses. By the way, the Lord takes them into the tent and talks to the three of them, like getting talked to by a parent. And then the Lord makes Miriam skin leprous with no obvious punishment for Aaron, but Miriam has to spend a week outside the camp, and then she comes back in, so just a week, right? And then the final one is against Moses and Aaron. And I kind of feel like the Lord's setting up Moses this time. So the Lord said to Moses, take the staff with you, and Aaron, gather everybody together, so get everybody together, and then speak to the rock. So before, he said, I'll stand before the rock and you strike it, which kind of like felt good to Moses, I would assume, right? But this time he asked him to do a much more humble action, which would be awkward. He tells him to speak to the rock. And so he's supposed to like say, like, in the name of the Lord, water come from the rock. And that's what he's called to do. And Moses is mad at this point in the story. He's got anger issues and breaking the tablet we've seen earlier. And he doesn't do what God commands. He strikes the rock just like he did before. And nothing happens the first time. So he strikes it again, right? So he has to strike it twice. The second time, water does come out of the rock. So God chooses to bless him, even though probably didn't deserve it, just like all of us, right? And also they go on to win a military battle after this, which is kind of neat, at Hormah, which is the same place where they had lost at Kadesh 40 years earlier, right? And so it's interesting to see what people's actions are and then the punishment. So the first one with Aaron and the calf, there was really no listed punishment for Aaron, right? I mean, there was for the people. With Miriam and Aaron, Miriam became leprous. So God described it as spitting in his face, and so she had to wait 7 days outside the camp. And then the third one with Moses and Aaron hitting the rock, their punishment is that they won't enter the promised land. So they're essentially given the same sentence as the people, that they're going to die in the desert. Only Caleb and Joshua carry on from the first generation to the promised land, which is really interesting. So what do you think God's reactions and punishment for each of these? Like, were they justified? Were they sufficient? Were they expected? And so we talked to the group about this. And so you can see there's a lot of words in here. I'd say the only things that I want to say is it's interesting how little is written about Aaron and punishments. And I think that's because it was just more personal. So it's not necessarily listed in the Bible, but I think that, Aaron went in like on the Day of Atonement, like he went in and presented the sins of all the people, and like they were on him. So like I think that you don't have to worry about Aaron getting away scot-free just because Aaron talked to God, and like if there was a punishment related to Aaron, it was more personal than what's listed in the Bible. Miriam's punishment wasn't great, but it was only for a week. And then the most interesting one is not letting Moses and Aaron go into the promised land. And different people read this differently. Most people read it, and I agree with them, that it's saying that Moses was the same as the other people, right? So they rejected God, and Moses got the same punishment as other people. He couldn't go in. Personally, I don't know. I kind of see it just a little different, not a lot different, but a little different. I see like when God brought the people up to Kadesh and sent in the 12 spies, he knew they weren't ready, right? But he works with us and he lets us choose. And so he knew that they were going to choose not to go in, and he wanted them not to go in because they weren't ready, right? And I think that this is similar, that the reason the Lord said to Moses, take your staff, is because he knew that he was putting Moses into a situation where he was going to fail, right? So he was fully aware that he's putting Moses into a situation where he's going to fail. And so why would God do that? And to be honest, I think it's because God didn't want him to go into the promised land, right? He wanted the leadership to pass. And you see this all the time where you're better off not having Moses do it. Moses has been here the whole time. We have to do it with Moses, but he wanted Joshua to be the one to go in, right? And so I think that he kind of set Moses up here a little bit. And Moses did fail to represent God here, and Moses got a punishment, and Moses accepted that punishment, and that made sense to Moses. But I think it's to fulfill God's bigger plan is really what's going on here. So Moses, he appears in the transfiguration of Jesus. Moses is in heaven. Moses is good, right? But God didn't want him in the promised land. He wanted somebody different to lead them. And so I think that explains why God set up this situation where he knew Moses was going to fail. So not really a slight against Moses, just how God worked his plan through Moses, right? So I think that's really an interesting story, and I think it teaches us more about the character of God, how God works with people. He lets people make their choices. He gives them what they choose, but he has a plan as well, right? So I just think that's interesting. Next story. So I think there's like 3 left. There's a bunch in this chapter. Sorry, these chapters are so dense. They just are, right? Next story is battles east of the Jordan. Maybe I'll try to speed it up a little bit. So the people spend a lot of time wandering in the desert. Miriam dies at Kadesh. She actually died at the same place where the speaking to the rock, hitting the rock twice story happened. So she died then. Aaron dies at Mount Hor. He's walked up to Mount Hor with Moses and Eleazar, and they transfer the high priest to Eleazar, make sure to show how that line is going to continue. Phinehas, I think, comes after Eleazar, but they established that process at Hor. And then they start fighting, right? So they fight Sihon and Og with victories. They walk around Edom, but so they should have gone through Edom, but they walked around. But we're definitely seeing some successes. And then with Moab, with Balaam and Balak, you can read those stories. They're fun to read. We're seeing success. So God blesses them through Balaam, which is the crazy person to bless them through. And they're successful against Moab, and they're winning, right? Like they're winning fights. They have a belief in God that the Lord will lead them, and they're winning. And then something really interesting happens. They have controlled this land. They try to go through it peacefully. God calls them to go through it peacefully. It doesn't work out. They have to fight. And so now they've won this land, right? And a lot of people, especially the people with the flocks, so Reuben, the firstborn, Gad, half tribe of Manasseh, they look around and they say, hey, this is good, right? Like, I know you promised us the promised land, right? But we're willing to settle for this. And there's tons of symbolism to the Garden of Eden here. Just copying everything Tim says about this. But they choose this instead of what God has picked for them, which is the promised land. And even crazier, you don't see anything bad happen about it for probably 1,000 years, right? I mean, maybe they have a harder time in the time of Judges with attacks and raids, but you don't really see anything happen until the exile of the Assyrians. This is the first people to go, right? And so it's just interesting that they picked not what God told them to do, and it's not immediately punished. It's many generations later before anything negative happens. But they settle outside the promised land as these 2.5 tribes. This is not it, right? And so, how does that relate to our lives? And so people are really bad. I think John said this one. People are really bad at figuring out what's good, right? And so they decide this is good. They leave their flocks and herds there. Moses isn't thrilled about it. He says, you're fracturing the people, which is just like we've seen before. You're leading us astray. They promise that they're going to still help fight in the promised land, and Moses compromises with them. Moses definitely compromises a few times. He also makes some compromises about divorce, but he's a leader and he's working with the people as well, and I think that's really interesting. So they settle outside the promised land, so 2.5 tribes worth. And so a lot of parallels here of standing outside of Eden, ready to go in. So I just thought I'd mention some of those things. What does it tell you about the character of God is always the question. The main thing it tells me is that God lets you choose and do the things that you choose. And if you choose something that's not God's will, there will be repercussions for it, but it may not happen the very next day. Right? I guess that's what I would learn about the character of God. Other things that are happening around this time period. So this story, I think, is one of the most significant. When they're in Moab, when they're fighting these military victories, and they're victorious over the fighting people of Moab, they're blessed by Balaam. They kill Balak. They win, right? And what they do is they're outside of the promised land, and so they're told to just kill the men. And so the women live on. So before and after the fighting, and during probably too. The Moabite women have a religious practice, so they worship many different gods. I forget the name of the god. Maybe it was Chemosh was one of their gods. But they practice sacred prostitution, which is an interesting practice. It's called prostitution because it's not like a love-based sex. It's not for money, though, right? So it says it down here, it was a way to make their god happy. So the god like Chemosh and other gods, maybe Asherah as well, but they would invite Israelite men to have sex with them as part of a religious practice for their god. And as you can see, sex is a weapon. It's really hard for these Israelite men to say no, right? To say, I'm not called to do that. And this analogy of adolescence, this is the going off to college moment of the Israelites, where there's a lot of temptations, sex being one of them, even for college, and you have to make a choice not to be a part of the world. Just as straight as we can say it. So you've got to have your home not be the earth. Your home is in heaven, right? And so your passport says, citizen of heaven on it, right? Like you don't live here. You're not in the world. You're not doing everything the world does. And we see this very clearly with the Moabite women. And it's one of the most significant failures of the Israelites here, in my opinion. And it is the time where they're no longer in the desert. They're kind of like more a part of the world. And right out of the box, we have huge failures. We choose to be yoked to this world and this land. So yoked to the people, the Baal of Peor. I guess it was probably one of the gods was Baal, right? Not just Chemosh. And we see this story of choosing to be part of the world many times in the Bible. Solomon, I think, is an excellent example. So Solomon started off so good, wrote so many things in the Bible, right? And those things are still valid, but he fell away, and he fell away because of his love for the world. And then the kingdom is divided after his time, and it's a sad story, right, of somebody that was so good falling so far. I do want to kind of give a little credit to not stereotyping as well. So Moabite women are kind of who's represented as the world here because of their sacred prostitution worship process. But it's not like all Moabite women are bad. They prove that coming up soon in the Bible here with the story of Ruth, which is part of the story even. So Ruth was a Moabite woman. She's part of the genealogy of Jesus. So it's not like all people of an ethnic group are bad. It's really just about saying their practices are bad. You shouldn't be a part of them. And there's a lot in the New Testament about putting on the armor of God so that you can stand against the schemes of the devil. Do not love the world or the things of the world. This is a very important message for us today that we just can't hear enough because we're so dumb. We keep doing it, right? I was at a petting zoo yesterday and I was like petting sheep and I was like, oh, we're compared to sheep. And sometimes I'm a sheep, right? And so just got to keep this in mind at the forefront of your brain as you're tempted in these ways. I think there's 2 stories left. Yep, so 2 stories left. Then we'll let you go for the day. One of the last things I want to say before we wrap up today is to prepare you for the next chapter. The next chapter is the Conquest, and it's going to be hard to read. It's going to be hard to go into and read, and so we need to prepare you for it some, right? And so in this chapter is when God gave the command to Moses. So God said, he said that I've delivered these people to you. You can read it as well, and you must destroy them totally. Like that's the phrase, right? Now, why would God say to destroy a people totally? Well, we'll read the rest of the sentence in a minute. But there's definitely reasons, which is what we've seen with the Moabite women, that the people won't be able to avoid the temptations of the world. And so God provides a way out of temptation, and it's preventative here is really what's happening. And they are gonna fall victim to the worship of these other gods. And so the destroy them totally really doesn't necessarily mean humans in their lives. I mean, it does, but it's not really what it means. It means like the practice of worship to other gods, the practice of not putting God first. If we could convert, this group of people, that would be better, right? It would destroy the gods quite effectively. It'd be a way of destroying what we're trying to destroy. But God has judged these people. It kind of says this down here in Genesis. So the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So God has been working with these people for hundreds of years, and they have failed. And God has judged them, and it's God's land, and it's time to clear it. Now, clearing it means to make it holy, but it actually goes on to say, don't make treaties with them. Now, if you read this line and this line, these are kind of like almost at opposite. So destroy them totally means nobody's left alive. In fact, that's what they say here. Save alive nothing that breathes, right? So like if there's nobody still alive, then why say don't make a treaty with them? Why say don't intermarry with them? Why say don't give your daughters to be their sons or their daughters for your sons? Why does it say that? Because obviously they're not going to completely kill everything that breathes, right? It's a little bit of, people use the term war rhetoric, and so there's definitely a little bit of war rhetoric, like a chant like we're going to kick the crap out of them, right? Like we're not going to really kick the crap out of them because that'd be disgusting, right? Maybe my generation stopped saying that, right? But it is just a little bit of war rhetoric that it's not quite literal because obviously there's going to be people left, right? And in this chapter, what it says is this is what you're to do to them. Break down their altars, smash their stones, cut down their Asherah poles, burn their idols. You're a people holy for the Lord, and the Lord has chosen that of all the people in the world, you're the treasured possession, and you're going to get this land. So know that God did command it. Know that it's coming, and you're going to see the words that the Lord told Moses. Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. You're going to see, and Joshua did it, and it's going to be much harder for you to read if you're not prepared for it, right? So just the question, I think question number 2 is the most interesting here. Why did the Lord have them do it? Like, why did he have them do it with the sword, right? Like, why did we do that? Because he could have just, sent a plague, right? He could have sent the Egyptians, which he did do to kind of clear the way a little bit with wars. He could have called civil war to where they killed each other. And some of those things did happen. But ultimately, he arms the Israelites, and they kill people themselves. And so one of the commands is don't murder. Like, why have all these people murder children, old people, right? And it was because it's necessary. It's because God does things with us. He doesn't just do things for us. We're involved in God's plan. And so we're going to see that with the sword next week, which is a hard thing to read. It should bother you. Like read it and be bothered. But also read it and know that it is God's command. Read it and know that they're doing God's will. And make sure you see the big picture. But it should be hard for you. And so there's some good quotes down here. So that's just kind of prepare you for chapter 7, which is going to be the hardest chapter we've read so far, and it's supposed to be. The last thing, so I'll just I don't like to finish on downers. The last thing I wanted to do is let's talk about the Sermon of Moses. I feel like I could read this all to you, except for you would get bored with me reading it to you. I encourage you to pause the video. If you can read this screen, go ahead and read it. If not, there's a link below to where you can bring it up. But this is snippets from Deuteronomy that the stories stitched together that are just really good. And the call is, they call it listen. So like listen to the Israelites. It meant, don't just let the sound waves hit your ears, right? But actually, let it impact your life, reflect on it, and then use it to make action. So listen to this speech and then let it affect you. And then love, so avah. And this speech, like it's all about listen and love, right? And really what it comes down to is to choose life. And so Moses in his life, he would, the people of Israel sinned and made a calf, and he came and he pleaded with God not to just destroy them. And then that happened again with, the 12 spies. He pleaded with God. God said he's going to destroy them, and started with Moses twice, right? And so Moses is always pleading with God for the sake of the people. And then here it's reversed. So he's pleading with the people, so the next generation, the ones that are going to the promised land, to choose life. And so that's kind of in green down here. So choose life. So listen to the voice of God, hold fast to him. That's like that word covenant. So covenant is really like to cling to God. And the Lord is your life. And then my crazy question of the day, this is just kind of a fun thing to end on, is God made the world. He made all the things that are set up into it. He made science. He made how things work. And at the core is reproduction, which requires two people, man and woman. And I just wonder if he did that so that we would understand this cling to, this hold to covenant relationship better. Because if we were asexually reproductive, then like we're just kind of all on our own, right? And that's not how he made us. And so scientists would say it's like, oh, well, it's necessary for diversity in the species, right? It was like, well, that's true, but it's a chicken and the egg type of problem, right? So I think that, God made us two that need to become one flesh and to exist, to continue. He made sex a blessing for that union of two that become one, so that we would understand God better, right? And so I think that this speech just made me think of that, and I thought I'd say it out loud. So our existence is to have a covenant relationship with God, where we become one with God, and we love God with all our heart. And as a result of that choice on our part, then God does his part of the deal as well. And for us, it's eternal life, and also to help you on your journey in the earth, right? So just a really powerful message. Really great to see that the first sermon in the Bible. It's just an amazing thing to read Deuteronomy. You can also watch a lot of the Bible story projects from Deuteronomy. They're really good. There's so many. All right, so that's it for this week. I think there were some discussion questions here, but I won't go into all the discussion questions because there's just so many. But it's fun to look and listen and think about those as well. So thanks for joining us. So next week is going to be the Conquest, which, like I say, is going to be a little bit harder. So, and Joshua did it is the take-home message. Thanks so much for joining us. Hopefully you continue to read through the story, continue to get a lot out of these chapters. I know that I have. So goodbye, Torah. We've missed you. It's been really fun. And next time we'll start in with a different historical book, the book of Joshua. See you then. Bye.